Hey everyone, thanks for tuning back into the Linwood Show. Today is going to be another solo episode. In the last episode, we talked about possibly doing another prophecy video, and that's the plan for today. Instead of looking at the prophecies about Jesus, I'm going to look at the prophecy, or we are going to look at the prophecies that Jesus made when he was here on this earth. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. All right, so the first one we're going to look at is in Matthew 16. It's starts in verse 21, and this is actually where Jesus is predicting his own death. It says, "From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life." This is also corroborated in Mark 32 through 34. Mark's account says, "They were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. 'We are going up to Jerusalem,' he said, 'and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise.'" Luke also chimes in on this in chapter 18, verses 31 through 34. Luke says, "Jesus took the 12 aside and told them, 'We are going up to Jerusalem, and everything that is written by the prophets about the Son of Man will be fulfilled. He will be delivered over to the Gentiles. They will mock him, insult him, and spit on him. They will flog him and kill him. On the third day he will rise again.'" The disciples did not understand any of this. Its meaning was hidden from them, and they did not know what he was talking about. And obviously, in all of the gospel accounts, I mean, this is the gospel, right? That Jesus was put to death and that on the third day he rose again. So that's kind of the whole point of the New Testament, is that he fulfilled that prophecy. All right, moving on to the second prophecy that Jesus prophesied and was again fulfilled. This is the destruction of the temple. In Matthew 24, it says, "Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. 'Do you see all these things?' he asked. 'Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down.'" This was corroborated in Mark chapter 13, verses 1 through 2. As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." "Do you see all these great buildings?" replied Jesus. "Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." Also corroborated in Luke chapter 21, verses 5 through 6. It says, "Some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus said, 'As for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down.'" And as recorded throughout numerous secular texts, the siege of Jerusalem, which occurred in 70 AD, the Roman military blockade of Jerusalem during the first Jewish revolt, marked the fall of the Second Temple, where basically there was a big tax revolt between the Jews and the Romans because the Romans were occupying the Jews, and basically the Romans put the smackdown on the Jews and destroyed their temple. And what's interesting to think about with this, as I was thinking about it earlier, I mean, this is so close to Jesus's lifetime, where you could have people who were children when Jesus was, about to be crucified, who saw him, heard his teachings, etc., who lived to see this prophecy fulfilled. So that you have people alive for both the prophecy and the fall of the temple. It's just super interesting to think about. Moving on to the third prediction that Jesus made that was fulfilled, prophecy that was fulfilled. comes to us in Matthew chapter 26, verses 20 through 25. It says, "When evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12, and while they were eating, he said, 'Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me.'" Then Mark 14, Mark also records this. It says, "When evening came, Jesus arrived with the 12. While they were reclining at the table eating, he said, 'Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me.' They were saddened, and one by one they said to him, 'Surely you don't mean me?' 'It is one of the 12,' he replied, 'one who dips bread into the bowl with me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him, but woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." John also records this in chapter 13. It says, "After he had said this, Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, 'Very truly I tell you, one of you is going to betray me.'" And this is fulfilled in Mark 14 again. It's actually kind of interesting because it's recorded as having happened prior to the prophecy. So whether you want to interpret this as divine knowledge or a prophecy of the fact that Jesus had already been sold by Judas, like the deal was already arranged but had not gone down yet, or whether you want to just interpret this as, well, Jesus heard, scuttlebutt from somewhere. That's your prerogative. However, it's recorded that that Judas makes this deal with the leaders of the church prior to Jesus making the prophecy that he would be betrayed by one of his 12. And then he's later, the deal that Judas made actually comes through to fruition. It says in Mark 14, verse 10, "Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money, so he watched for an opportunity to hand him over." It's also corroborated in Matthew 26. It says, "Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, 'What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?' So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over." And also Luke chapter 22 and John chapter 13 also chime in and lend credence to this as well. Moving on to the fourth thing that Jesus predicted, and it's recorded came true. It's Matthew 26, starting in verse 31. This is Jesus predicting Peter's denial. "Then Jesus told them, 'This very night you will all fall away on account of me, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee.' Peter replied, 'Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will.' 'Truly I tell you,' Jesus answered, 'this very night, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. But Peter declared, 'Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you.' And all the other disciples said the same." Mark 14 also corroborates this. Starting in verse 27, "You will all fall away," Jesus told them, "for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Peter declared, "Even if all fall away, I will not." "Truly I tell you," Jesus answered, "today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times." But Peter insisted emphatically, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the others said the same. John 13 also chimes in as well. And John records it a little bit differently, which I think adds some fresh perspective on it. Starting in verse 31 of chapter 13, "When he was gone, Jesus said, 'Now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will glorify the Son in himself, and will glorify him at once. My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I have told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come. A new command I give to you, Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." Simon Peter asked him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus replied, "Where I am going you cannot follow now, but you will follow later." Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Then Jesus answered, "Will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times." This is fulfilled later on in Matthew chapter 26, starting in verse 69. Now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. "You also were with Jesus of Galilee," she said. But he denied it before them all. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. Then he went out to the gateway, where another servant girl saw him and said to the people there, "This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth." He denied it again with an oath, "I don't know that man. I don't know the man." After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, "Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away." Then he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, "I don't know the man." Immediately a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken, "Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. This is also corroborated in Mark chapter 14, verses 66 through 72. Basically the same as Matthew 26. Luke also chimes in chapter 22, verses 54 through 62. Basically the same sequence of events. Also, John chapter 18, verses 15 through 18. John gives a little bit different account. Starting in verse 15, Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, but Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" she asked Peter. He replied, "I am not." It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. Then jumping down to verse 25, meanwhile Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself. So they asked him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him, "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Again Peter denied it, and at that moment a rooster began to crow. And lastly, the fifth and final one that we're going to look at today is when Jesus predicts the coming of the Holy Spirit. John chapter 14, verses 16 through 17 says, "And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to help you and be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. The world cannot accept him because it neither sees him nor knows him. But you know him, for he lives with you and will be in you." The fulfillment of this is in Acts chapter 2. Starting in verse 1, when the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. So that's going to wrap up the 5 predictions that Jesus made that are recorded to be coming true in the New Testament. On the heels of this and the last episode where we discussed how the coming of Jesus was prophesied and over 500 to 700 years before he came, and now this where Jesus is prophesying things that come true in a matter of hours or days or years, one generation, how all of that's coming true. I want to go over a few things that kind of lend credence to the authenticity of the New Testament. A lot of people ask for historical proof that show that the New Testament is correct or true or things like that. They a lot of people question the authenticity of the New Testament because you have seeming contradictions between the gospel accounts where, sometimes different authors will give different points of view or different details about certain events. However, one thing that they don't disagree on is the fact that Jesus was a real person. He really did do miracles. He really did die, and he really did come back to life on the third day. That is the base belief for all of Christianity. So, jumping back to the question of the authenticity of the New Testament, or how historically accurate is the New Testament, faithfacts.org kind of has a cheat sheet for different statistics on this. They record that there's over 5,000 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, and 9,000 other manuscripts, totaling over 24,000 manuscript copies or portions of the New Testament. Looking at this in contrast to copies of manuscripts that we have discussing historical figures like Caesar or Tacitus or Plato. For Caesar, we have 10 copies that range, from the first to the last, over 1,000 years. Tacitus, we have 20 copies of manuscripts with, again, about 1,000-year gap. And Plato, there's 7 copies of manuscripts that have a 1,200-year gap. And the 24,000 that look at the New Testament are dated from 100 to 300 years after the originals. So if we're looking at the New Testament as a historical document, just outside of the context of religion or anything like that, if you were to look at the fact that we have 24,000 manuscripts that are all within a very condensed time window, very close to the events that they're talking about, in contrast that with Caesar, Tacitus, and Plato, whom no one questions being a valid historical figure, there's much more secular historical evidence, just tangibly, for the New Testament being real than for Caesar being real, or Tacitus being real, or Plato being real. And whether you choose to believe the things that are recorded in the New Testament or not is a separate issue. Whether you choose to believe that Jesus is God incarnate who came down from his throne in heaven to become the perfect sacrifice on behalf of you, his creation, because no man or woman is enough, because all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Whether you choose to believe that or not is separate from the fact that the historical veracity of the New Testament is virtually unrivaled. So anyway, that's going to do it for today. I hope that you enjoyed this little short solo episode where we discussed some predictions that Jesus made during his lifetime and where they came true in the New Testament. We also talked about briefly at the end here the historical veracity of the New Testament. I would invite you, if you're interested in Christianity, if you're interested in digging deeper into what is this thing that's been sitting, in hotel nightstand drawers that I never look at, or sitting on my nightstand that I haven't looked at in years, I would invite you to just open it up and read it. Set your preconceived notions aside. Set your modern Western mindset aside. Just open it up and let it speak to you and see what it has to offer. If you have any suggestions for topics that you want me to cover, any questions you may have, feel free to reach out. My details are in the description below. And with that, we'll see you next time.